Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Incarnational Inkwell podcast. I'm your host, Adam Lacrosse, and this is the show where we develop a deeper relationship with Jesus Christ by diving into literature. This episode, I'll be discussing Homer's Odyssey. Last episode, I talked about the Iliad, and this episode, I'll be discussing a sort of pseudo-sequel to the Iliad, Homer's Odyssey. Now, as we've discussed previously, we're talking a lot about Greek literature right now in the podcast, and how sort of the Greek thought will go on to be later developed into medieval thought, and then later on down the line even into our modern world. And there's many interesting parallels between the story of Odysseus and in the Odyssey, and I think our modern ideas about journeying towards heaven. So that's kind of the main question I want to focus on today, is how can Odysseus' journey prepare us for our own journey toward heaven? As I like to do with all of my texts, I like to basically take the very first sentence of the text to see if that provides any sort of hints as to what the rest of the text is going to be about. Any sort of hints about what kind of characters we might meet. So here is the first line of Homer's Odyssey. Sing to me of the man, Muse, the man of twists and turns, driven time and again off course, once he had plundered the hallowed heights of Troy. So again, Homer is invoking the Muse, this mythical spirit that would often inspire his poetry, and he wants the Muse to help him tell the story of this man of twists and turns, who has been driven off course from the hallowed heights of Troy. And again, we're talking about the man Odysseus. Odysseus, of course, being a warrior in the Trojan War, he didn't get much screen time in the Iliad from what I can recall. However, he is credited with coming up with the idea of the Trojan horse. That wooden horse invention, there were a bunch of Greeks hidden inside this wooden horse. The Trojans thought that the Greeks had surrendered and were leaving the wooden horse as a peace offering, so they took the wooden horse inside, not knowing that Greeks were inside the horse, and the Greeks burst out of the horse and slaughtered a bunch of Trojans in the middle of the night. So, before I go too much into the main plot, I'd like to give a little bit more of a bird's eye view of kind of setting the scene, what we're dealing with here in the Odyssey. So the book actually starts in the middle. It doesn't actually start in the beginning with Odysseus leaving the Trojan War. It starts in the middle of the action, what we in the literary world would call in media res. That means kind of in the middle of in a middle resting spot in between the rising action and the climax. So it's been 10 years since the Trojan War. The Trojan War has lasted for 10 years, as you'll recall in the Iliad, and Odysseus' son Telemachus and his mother, Odysseus' wife Penelope, are anxiously waiting for Odysseus to come home. Now, Odysseus is the king of a land called Ithaca. And while he has been away at war, a bunch of suitors have come to Ithaca to try and ask for Penelope's hand in marriage, because they presume that Odysseus is dead. So if one of them can marry the queen, they will inherit his title and his wealth and his servants and everything that he has power over. Now, of course, to our modern sensibilities, this might seem a little bit strange, a bunch of men just all of a sudden bursting into your home and demanding food and drink and demanding that they marry your wife, even though you two are technically still married. But if we analyze this through the lens of the ancient Greek world, this was actually fairly common. I did some research, and this idea of ancient Greek hospitality sprung up more than once throughout my reading of the text. It was common knowledge that visitors and guests were supposed to be treated with the utmost politeness and the utmost respect, because the person who was hosting the guests on one day might end up becoming the guest of another person the following day. So this idea of let's be hospitable and let's treat everyone fairly and with respect just kind of came with that sort of ancient Greek sensibility, just because of the fact that the role of host and guest could flip-flop so often and so easily. And we will see this throughout the rest of Odysseus' story. Now, I have decided, for the sake of clarity of this podcast episode, that I will not actually be going through the book kind of chapter by chapter, just because it does start in the middle of the action. What I will be doing is I will be basically going all the way back to the end of the Trojan War and telling Odysseus' story from that point up to chapter 1. Just so you can kind of get the full picture of the story and what's happened to Odysseus so far to get him to the place where he is in chapter 1. If you want to know kind of why it's structured in the middle of the action and how he ends up in the middle of the action, basically he's been stranded on an island for several years with the nymph Calypso, and the gods finally let him off this island. He's been stranded there. He washes up on another island, and the king of that island, Alcinous, wants to kind of know where Odysseus has been, what all has happened to him, because he's just one man stranded without any sort of fleet or extra men or extra ships whatsoever. So Odysseus ends up telling him the story of what all has happened, and that's what I'm going to tell you now. I'm going to basically tell you what Odysseus told King Alcinous and how he got into that predicament. It's kind of a long story, but I'll hit the main points. So Odysseus leaves with a fleet of 600 men sailing from Troy to Ithaca. This is a journey that should last about 2 to 3 weeks, according to kind of modern historians' analysis of it. Modern map making. This is a journey that should have taken him about 2 to 3 weeks. This ends up taking him 10 years. It's a long journey to get home. And it starts out, they go from Troy. They manage to meet these men known as the Lotus Eaters. They are low on food, so they go and stock up at the Lotus Eater Island. They plan on grabbing some lotus to take with them for nourishment. But Odysseus notices that the Lotus Eaters are kind of in this la-la land state. They're very nonsensical, they don't really have a care in the world, and they're just very content to daydream and not really do much, just laze around. And Odysseus realizes that it has something to do with the lotus. The lotus is kind of this reddish flower. They're eating this lotus, and as they're eating this lotus, it is dulling their senses and causing them to just kind of basically do nothing. And some of Odysseus' men eat the lotus as well. And Odysseus is trying to basically bat the lotus away, saying, hey, guys, we have a mission here. I need to get back to my wife. I need to get back to my son. You need to get back home to Ithaca. And we can't be distracted by this magic flower. So he ends up basically dragging the men kicking and screaming back to the ships without the lotus, and he sails off from the Lotus Eater Island, knowing that there is some better food to eat in a cave from what he's been told. But that cave belongs to a very bloodthirsty enemy of Odysseus. As they arrive at this cave, they realize that it is filled to the brim with sheep and goats and bulls, all sorts of livestock, and they go and they have a huge feast, wine and meat and cheese in this cave. And as the sun goes down, they realize that this cave is owned by a giant one-eyed cyclops named Polyphemus. And Polyphemus is a cyclops. He's also a very simple shepherd. And Odysseus has just killed some of his sheep unannounced to Polyphemus. Polyphemus does not know who Odysseus is. Stepping back for a little bit to what I was talking about to hospitality, we can see this in another light. Just as the suitors are abusing Penelope's hospitality, Odysseus is now abusing Polyphemus's supposed hospitality by eating one of his sheep and acting as if it's no big deal. And so Polyphemus is like, well, you're gonna have to die now. You killed some of my sheep, so it's only fair, a life for a life. I'm gonna basically kill you and all your men. And Odysseus, ever the quick thinker, this is one of his traits. He is favored by the goddess Athena, who is the goddess of wisdom. He takes some of the wine that he had brought from the ship and offers it to the Cyclops. Now, wine in ancient Greece is much, much more potent. It had a very high alcohol content, much higher than what we would have today. So the Cyclops slurps it all down, and he becomes drunk, and the Cyclops is like, well, that was some good wine. I mean, I suppose I'll have to think about killing you, but please, at least let me know your name. And Odysseus, ever the quick thinker, says, my name is Nobody. So Polyphemus, oddly enough, if we break down his name, Poly meaning many and Phemus meaning like sound or name, his name means many name, and Odysseus just told the Cyclops that his name was Nobody. He is literally no man. So Polyphemus snatches up some of the men, eats them, and immediately falls down drunk, unconscious. Now there's a huge boulder in the cave, so Odysseus and the remaining men cannot escape. But Odysseus knows that they need to act fast. So he takes the club that Polyphemus used to kill some of his men, and he sharpens it into a spear. And he goes up to the sleeping Cyclops and stabs him in the eye, blinding him. And the Cyclops is crying out in pain. And the other nearby Cyclops who were wandering nearby, they go and they open up the cave entrance. They go and roll the huge stone away. And they say, what's wrong, Polyphemus? What's wrong? And Polyphemus is crying out in pain. And he says, nobody is hurting me. Nobody is hurting me. He's using Odysseus' name that he gave the Cyclops. And, well, the other Cyclops think, well, if no one's hurting you, then you're just having a nightmare or something. This isn't our problem. And they leave the cave door open and they wander away. And so Odysseus and the remaining men take some of the sheep, slip out of the Cyclops cave, and this is where Odysseus makes his first big mistake. Odysseus is so filled with pride at this point. As soon as he hops on his ship, he yells to the Cyclops and he says, I tricked you. I told you my name was Nobody, but my name is really Odysseus, king of Ithaca. You slaughtered my men, and I will remember them. I hope you remember me. My name is King Odysseus of Ithaca. And that is his first big mistake. Because Polyphemus, still blind, still enraged, calls out to his divine father, Poseidon. Now, if you know your Greek mythology, you would know that Poseidon is the god of the sea. And Polyphemus prays to Poseidon and says, I want you to curse Odysseus. Either kill him or make it absolute hell for him to come home. And so this huge storm all of a sudden raises up. There's thunder and lightning and waves crashing all around, and the men can barely row to try and avoid some of these waves. And Odysseus manages to spot a large floating island off in the distance. So he takes a harpoon and he chucks it up to this island in the sky. And he crawls up the harpoon. And who should be living in this island in the sky but the wind god Aeolus? And he says, now, Aeolus, you're the god of the winds. There is a crazy storm. Could you help us get a safe passage home?" And Aeolus says, "Sure." He takes a bag and puts all of the storm winds into the bag and ties the bag shut. And he says, "Here, take this bag. It's got all the storm winds in it. And as long as you don't open it for 10 days, you will have clear skies and calm seas and everything will be fine." So Odysseus goes and takes the bag, and he just goes back to his ship. And he's like, "Look, guys, whatever we do, don't open the bag." Well, the men are hungry, the men are tired, the men think that it's treasure. So 9 days pass, they open up the bag, and all of a sudden, the storm winds burst out, and he gets tossed to and fro and winds up on a completely different island. A very peaceful island, a very calm island. What he doesn't realize, however, is that this island is home to a nefarious witch named Circe. Circe is a nymph. She is in charge of other nymphs. And so some of the remaining men, they go to check out the island, but they do not return. So Odysseus gets a little concerned, and just before he starts wandering into Circe's home, the god Hermes, the god of messengers, comes down and he's like, "Listen, Circe is a powerful witch, and you're just a mortal. You do not have any divine powers, so I'm going to give you a magical flower. If you consume this flower, you will be immune from her magic, immune from her charms, immune from her spells." So Odysseus takes this flower, which Hermes calls moly. That's where we get the expression holy moly from. Takes this flower, eats it, and he confronts Circe. Circe basically tells Odysseus that his men were so rude, so ruthless, just complete beasts, that she used her magic wand and turned Odysseus' men into pigs. She's like, well, if these men are going to act like pigs, then they're going to actually become pigs. So that's what she did. Now, she tries to turn Odysseus into a pig, but that doesn't work because, of course, the magic moly flower is making him immune to her magic. And Odysseus is like, "Please, I want to get home. Please just tell me how to get home. Poseidon is after me. I can't do this anymore. It's just all a big mess." And Circe says, "Fine. I will undo the spell on your men, and I will give you a way home. However, you need to have sex with me first." So Odysseus has a choice to make. He can either refuse sex from a very powerful magical nymph and stay true to his wife, or he can have sex, have his men restored, and have his way home. Well, there's a big double standard when it comes to sexuality in Greece. Women are supposed to be pure and chaste, but men can kind of do whatever they want sexually, and it's not considered immoral or lustful or anything like that. So he goes, has sex with Circe, and Circe is like, "Look, there's a way to get you home, but you need to gain instructions from a prophet named Tiresias. There's only one problem, however. Tiresias is dead. He's a prophet in the underworld." So Circe basically uses her magic, gets Odysseus and his men to the underworld, and he meets with Tiresias the prophet, and he says, "Look, things are bad at home. The suitors want to marry your wife Penelope. Penelope has been keeping them at bay, promising that as soon as she finishes a burial shroud for you, she'll get remarried. But as soon as she comes close to finishing the burial shroud, she undoes all of her hard work, so she's trying to delay these suitors." And he's like, "Look, you need to get home. I'll get you the quickest way home, but whatever you do, you need to head to past the island of the sun god Helios. whatever you do now, make sure you don't eat any of Helios's cattle, because Helios is the sun god, and he's going to be very upset if you eat some of his cattle. So, of course, Odysseus tells his men as soon as they're sailing by the island of Helios, whatever we do, guys, don't eat the sun god's cattle. Well, the men are really hungry. They end up eating the cattle, and a huge storm blows in again. And this is another big mistake. Odysseus is just trying to get home. His goal has remained the same throughout the Odyssey. He's just trying to get home, but he can't. There are all these slip-ups. And one of the last big slip-ups that happens, at least while he's out to sea, is this duel between two great monsters. This sea serpent named Scylla, or Scylla, depending on your pronunciation, and a giant whirlpool named Charybdis. Now, Odysseus is really in a pickle here, because if he sails and goes more toward Charybdis, his entire fleet is going to drown, and he's not going to make it home. If he sails by Scylla, Scylla's going to eat some of his men, but at least he'll be able to make his way home. So he has a choice to make. He ends up choosing Scylla because he knows that less of his men will die, and Scylla basically eats some of his men, shoots him off, the storm gets crazy, blasts to the island of Calypso. Calypso falls in love with him, and then he's finally freed, as I talked about in the beginning of the book. And he makes his way home. Now, that's, like you said, a long story that's really been condensed. I left out a few details, like he meets the ghost of Agamemnon down in the underworld. He meets the ghost of Achilles. He meets the ghost of Hercules. There are a couple little minor episodes that I didn't mention in there. If you're really liking this kind of summary, I would highly encourage you to read the Odyssey in full, because it is a fantastic story. But before we wrap up Odysseus' tale here, I want to talk about what's happening in Ithaca. I kind of mentioned it a little bit with Penelope. She's making this burial shroud to ward off the suitors. But Telemachus, Odysseus' son, is very anxious to see his father. And so he has been traveling. He meets with some royalty from neighboring islands to try and discern where his father is. Telemachus has been created by the goddess Athena, and Athena gives him bravery to basically confront the suitors. And so while Odysseus is sailing back home, Telemachus arranges with the suitors, and he says, look, you want to marry my mom? Fine, but you got to prove that you're warrior enough. Take my dad's bow, set up 12 hand axes, and if you can shoot the arrow through the hand axes at the bullseye and get a bullseye, then you will be worthy enough to marry my mom. And the suitors agree. Now, at this point in the story, Odysseus has arrived back on Ithaca, but Athena has used her magic to disguise him as an old beggar. A lot of the suitors pick on him. They even convince him to fight another beggar at one point. He beats him without using his amazing strength and cunning. And Odysseus steps up and says, fine, I am also a suitor, and I would like to try for Penelope's hand. Well, this is Odysseus' own bow that Telemachus wants the men to use. So Odysseus takes the bow, fires his shot, and gets straight through to the bullseye. He whips off his cloak. Athena undoes the magical disguise spell, and Odysseus and Telemachus just go to town and slaughter all of the suitors. His house is now bathed in blood. And just as it seemed like everything will be hunky-dory and he will be happy with Penelope, Penelope goes, not so fast. I'm not sure if you are my husband. I'm not so convinced. So she calls to one of her servants and says, servant, this man has been so brave, I want him to sleep in my bed tonight. Bring out my bed so that he may sleep in my bed. And Odysseus, realizing that his wife is testing him, chuckles to her and he says, "That is impossible. I built the bed around a tree, a living tree, and the tree cannot be moved. Therefore, the bed cannot be moved." And so, of course, Odysseus has passed his wife's, Penelope's, test. They embrace. Everyone lives happily ever after. Some of the suitor's relatives try and take revenge on Odysseus, but Athena steps in and brings peace to the island of Ithaca, and Odysseus can finally rest knowing that he is safe and that he is home. It's a great, great story. But now you might be thinking, sure, it's a wonderful story. Sure, all of this stuff has happened to Odysseus, but what does that have to do with me and my life as a Christian, as a Catholic? Let me put it to you this way. I think oftentimes we can be confronted with our own weakness, our own temptations, our own limitations, and we can kind of give up on ourselves. We don't often use all the tools in our toolbox. We don't use the Holy Spirit. We don't use the graces we've been given through our baptism. We don't use the writings of the saints. We don't use those who have gone before us. We don't use all these things, and we just kind of feel defeated. But we know that the goal is still heaven, just like Odysseus' goal was still to get home. And Odysseus made mistakes, just like we can make mistakes. We can still sin and trip up on our way home to heaven. That doesn't mean we can't be forgiven, just like it didn't mean that Odysseus couldn't find a workaround. And some of these trials and temptations can be really tough, just like Odysseus with Polyphemus, or just like Odysseus with the monster Scylla and the whirlpool Charybdis. It can require us to make some tough choices. But heaven is still the goal for us, my friends, just like Ithaca was still the goal for Odysseus. Like Therese of Lisieux is fond of saying, "The world is my ship and not my home. We are on our journey home." We have been given so many graces, so many blessings through what Jesus Christ has done for us, my friends. So do not give up hope. Keep pushing forward like Odysseus. Keep reminding yourself that the journey towards heaven is a journey worth fighting for. And if you get stuck along the way, go ahead, reroute, ask for the graces to remove obstacles of sin in your life, go to confession, and the Lord will be waiting to give you strength, just like the gods were able and willing to give Odysseus assistance. So I really hope and pray that this episode of the podcast blessed you. This is one of my favorite books. This was a really fun episode to record. I hope you got a lot out of it. Please like, subscribe, comment, all that good stuff. If you've got friends who prefer an audio format, I also do it here on both YouTube and Spotify. So go ahead, please share this, because I am trying to make this and grow this into a ministry, touching people's lives, bringing them closer to Christ through the power of literature. Have a good day, everyone, and God bless you.